Okay, we're going to get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the new season of Cardiovascular Grand Rounds here at Westchester Medical Center. As you know, we started a week later for unforeseeable reasons. And I'm very happy to say that we're starting with a completely new audiovisual system. It's not only the new room, but the system is new. It has some added capabilities to what we had in the previous room. We have people that are watching us live now. We're also recording this, and we're also going to be able to record through the microphones any questions and answers we have after the talk, and we will post this on the web. And we will be working towards actually getting and offering CME in the future by not only watching us live, as we offer already, but offering later. Since a number of the people in the audience are going to be future speakers, remember for your presentation not to have any patient identifiers, because then we will not be able to post that for HIPAA reasons. I also want to remind everyone about the Westchester Cardiovascular Symposium. We're now less than a month from the first days, October 12th through 14th, is the most important activity we're doing from a CME standpoint. And we are at the point that our CME department starts looking at the number of registrations, so please go ahead and register, and you can do that online. There's an updated web platform, so I understand that it's very easy to use, so please go ahead and register. Actually, if you go to iCare, right on iCare, you can click and go directly to the registration page. Next week, the visiting professor of the month is Dr. Vlahakis, who is a professor of surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital. He's not only the person who trained one of our own surgeons, Dr. Goldberg, but he's also very interested in obstructive hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and actually that would be the subject of his presentation. So given our recent interest and involvement, both clinically, interventionally, and surgically with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, I think it will be a very timely and I'm sure interesting presentation. So the speaker for today, for first round, will be none other than our Dr. Ahmad. And for those of you who are not very familiar with, when we think about TAVR, we know that TAVR is, the R stands for replacement, and when we think MitraClip, we think it's a valve replacement as well, but it's a valve repair. So a transcatheter mitral valve replacement, which is the title of his talk, is really looking into the future. So when I saw the title of Dr. Ahmad's presentation, I was very happy, because I think that is one of the purposes of these Grand Rounds, is to allow us to look what is coming down the pike. Hassan, thank you very much.
Thank you. So I was talking to Gilbert, and he was like, surgery? You don't need surgery for the mitral valve. You have another catheter, and we just put another valve in it, and that's all you need. And when you look at some of these talks at conferences, it really does look fantastic when they do transcatheter mitral valve replacement. It looks beautiful and really is great. Obviously, reality is a little bit different. So no disclosures. So I'll briefly go over the current status of TAVR and valvular heart disease, a brief overview of mitral valve disease, the MitraClip procedure and associated annuloplasty procedures, and then finally we'll talk about transcatheter mitral valve replacement. So as we all know, that patients, as they're getting older, and the number of patients who are older is increasing, the prevalence of valvular disease is increasing, not only aortic valve, mitral valve, but tricuspid valvular disease. With this increasing patient age, there's more complexity of the disease. There is more advanced medical therapy, and surgical expertise has gotten better, but there's still room for minimally invasive procedures in a subset of patients. So TAVR volume has gone up exponentially. This is a somewhat older slide, but volume is even higher, not only in the U.S., but everywhere in the world. And this push for transcatheter valve procedures, transcatheter procedures for other valves is in big part being driven by the success of TAVR, where TAVR has taken off in such a big way. People have noticed that perhaps there's room for treating other valvular disease with a catheter. So what about mitral valve disease? So I think we all know that mitral regurgitation, and I'll primarily talk about mitral regurgitation in this talk, mitral stenosis being somewhat of a separate entity. But we all know that primary MR, where the problem is with the valve, is bad for the patient, and it increases their chances of dying. I can show you a similar slide for secondary MR, where the problem is with the ventricle, and the valve itself may be okay. So we all understand that mitral regurgitation is bad and associated with increased mortality. And there are two primary causes of mitral regurg. There's degenerative MR, where mitral valve prolapse is the most common. And this is typically treated with surgical repair, sometimes with replacement, but mostly with surgical repair. And in high-risk patients with various transcatheter procedures, edge-to-edge repair, coronary sinus annuloplasty, direct annuloplasty. The other entity is functional MR, where the secondary to ischemic heart disease is the most common entity. And the implication of this disease is that it's frequently, with surgical repair and replacement, is done at the time of some other type of heart surgery. So typically these patients don't go for surgical repair of the valve unless they're going for, say, coronary artery bypass surgery. And transcatheter procedures are being trialed for this entity, although not approved at this time. So as we all know, degenerative MR is not all degenerative MR is the same. There comes in many different flavors. And functional MR may not be the same thing either. There's symmetric tethering, asymmetric tethering of the leaflets, causing a variability in the regurgitation. So in reality, you can have a lot of mixed mitral valve disease with 6 leaflet segments, 2 commissures, 2 pathologies, a lot of overlap, and an almost an infinite number of possibilities. And we see that when we evaluate patients for mitral valve repair, where they don't neatly fit into one box or another. So in 2017, for primary MR, for low-risk patients, they go for mostly open mitral valve repair, infrequently for replacement, and then there are variations on some sort of minimally invasive type of surgery. For high-risk patients, really, subset go for surgery if they're getting, say, for example, coronary artery bypass surgery, and then the other subset may be eligible for edge-to-edge repair or MitraClip. Really, all of the other devices, annuloplasty, transcatheter devices, are in trial. They're not really commercially available. For secondary MR, really, the treatment is primarily medical at this time. In Europe, they're doing edge-to-edge repair for secondary MR, but in the U.S., really, it's medical therapy, and then you can be enrolled in a trial for the MitraClip device. So that's the treatment paradigm for secondary MR. So mitral valve surgery. So mitral valve repair is better than replacement for primary MR. I think we all know that. And for secondary or functional MR, mitral valve replacement and repair in terms of mortality are equivalent, but mitral valve replacement associated with less recurrent MR. So both modalities, so surgery is in its essence good for mitral regurgitation. It's tried and true, and it works. But one has to remember the risk, the surgical risk of the patient, which is what drives transcatheter repair and devices. So, as I said, mitral valve surgery is a treatment of choice for most patients, except the patients at highest risk. So we'll switch gears a little bit and just talk about why designing a transcatheter mitral valve device in these high-risk patients is challenging. So there are four components of the mitral valve. There's the annulus, there's the leaflet, chordae, and the papillary muscle. And the pathology that affects the valve and the ventricle can affect any four of these components. So as you can imagine, designing a device can be difficult. Not only that, the mitral valve is a saddle-shaped structure, so it's not simple like a circular annulus for an aortic valve. And there are a bunch of surrounding structures near the mitral valve, not only the valve apparatus itself, but the coronary sinus and the circumflex artery, which can all be affected by any sort of device. And then, last but not least, there's the presence of the aortic valve itself. So I'll briefly talk about what's commercially available, which is the MitraClip device, which is basically edge-to-edge repair of the anterior and posterior leaflets, analogous to the Alfieri stitch. So currently it's approved for primary MR, for patients who are prohibitive risk for open surgery, and for secondary MR, patients are enrolled in the COAPT trial, the results of which should be available by early next year. So this is basically what the device looks like. This is the latest iteration of the MitraClip. It's called the NT. It has longer grasping arms. This is a 3D picture of what the device looks like as it's being delivered across the mitral valve. So once again, thousands of MitraClip procedures have been done all over the planet. The U.S. MitraClip volume also has gone up a lot. There are some issues with the MitraClip that one should consider. Where to clip, how many clips, is there tissue to grab, is there calcification, is the mitral valve area big enough? So the FDA labeling for anatomical success, or for success of the procedure based on anatomy, is that if the jet is central and not at the commissures, the mitral valve area is big or greater than 4.0, minimal calcification in the grasping area, no cleft in the grasping area, a flail gap less than 10, and a flail width less than 15, and a ventricle that's not too severely diseased, less EF greater than 20%, and a ventricle that's not too dilated. Both a flail width greater than 15 or a flail gap more than 10 makes the whole procedure quite a bit more difficult. So it's something to keep in mind when you're evaluating the patient. There are other cases one might want to avoid: rheumatic inflammatory disease, healed endocarditis, a small valve, short posterior leaflet, calcified leaflets, and a big dilated ventricle with a broad jet, which may be difficult to get rid of the entire regurgitant jet. So in general, MitraClip is safe. The rates of reintervention are low. One can use multiple clips, up to 4 clips, to optimize MR reduction. For primary MR, the results are better than for functional MR. The presence of residual MR and tricuspid regurg does affect survival. As I mentioned, anatomical features and patient selection is a key to success. And we talked about the COAPT trial already, which will assess patients for functional MR. So one way to possibly address the shortcomings of MitraClip, which just pulls the 2 leaflets together with a clip, is doing a percutaneous annuloplasty along with the MitraClip procedure. So this is just a quick timeline of the MitraClip procedure and various annuloplasty devices that are mostly available in Europe, but under trial in various hospitals in the U.S., but not commercially available. And so basically, this is what a surgical annuloplasty looks like, and this is what one of the annuloplasty devices looks like, which is a Cardiobrand, cinching the mitral annulus together and then putting a MitraClip in between might be a sort of a hybrid procedure. Just remember that MitraClip itself is time-intensive, and the percutaneous annuloplasty procedure is extremely time-intensive. So it's, even in the best of hands, it's very time intensive. So this is one potential bridge to transcatheter mitral valve replacement, but maybe too many hours, and the expertise required to do it would be, difficult to attain for a lot of operators. So why might mitral valve replacement be preferred over repair? Well, obviously there's the compliance with medical therapy. Most patients are unwilling or unable to take their Lasix and various other medications. And even if you do MitraClip, you may be left with residual MR. And we've seen, anecdotally at least, that sometimes with poor medical compliance, mitral regurgitation can come back. There's also the limitation of the transcatheter mitral valve procedure. The mitral valve, basically the MitraClip, as I mentioned. So there are anatomical limitations, patient limitations, so you can't really apply it to everybody. And there are some other issues. So recurrent MR is associated with worse survival for patients who undergo surgical repair. And I think you can extend that to patients who undergo transcatheter repair. When you look at surgical treatment for ischemic mitral regurgitation, repair is associated with more MR, and consequently, repair is also associated with higher rates of rehospitalization. So replacement in a surgical setting is more durable than repair. And some of the latest guidelines do recommend mitral valve replacement given certain anatomical features of the ventricle, such as leaflet tethering, an aneurysm or dyskinesis, and a big ventricle, as opposed to mitral valve repair for ischemic MR. Looking at the 5-year data from the Everest trial, which was one of the Everest 2 trial, one of the pivotal trials comparing MitraClip with surgery, you can see that surgery is better at getting rid of or eliminating MR compared to MitraClip. And that result is seen even 5 years out. So surgery does reduce MR more than MitraClip does. So MitraClip is not necessarily a complete solution to the problem, let's say. And when you look at various registries and European real-life data, the rates of recurrent moderate severe MR range anywhere from 41% to 7%. And for various devices that treat the annulus with transcatheter repair, it's anywhere from 32 to 10%. So residual MR is a problem, and as we know, it's associated with worse outcomes. One other entity where transcatheter mitral valve replacement might trump other methods is mitral annular calcification. So I think a lot of the surgeons can attest to this, that severe mitral annular calcification does make the surgery more complicated. There's a risk of AV group disruption, increased surgical time, affects the size of the valve that's placed. There's a risk of paravalvular leak. Elderly patients tolerate involved surgery like this a lot less. Mitral annular calcification comes in different flavors, circumferential to partial. And this is an example of placing a Sapien XT valve inside a calcified mitral annulus in a very high-risk patient who certainly was not eligible for mitral valve surgery. So when this procedure is done, it's consistently done well. The technical success is good. The main issues with this procedure: LVOT obstruction, embolization of the valve, and then need for open surgery. This is just a cohort of about 104 patients, but no annular rupture. technical success improves the more you do the procedure, obviously. The incidence of left ventricular outflow tract obstruction does remain an Achilles heel of this procedure, and I'll come back to that later. And the need for a second valve also does decline. So we do get better at it as the more we do it. So TMVR in MAC is, MAC meaning mitral annular calcification, is possible in a select cohort of patients. LVOT obstruction is an issue, but it can be addressed with some techniques that I'll talk about in a minute. There is a trial that's looking at patients who are getting mitral valve and ring, mitral valve and valve, or mitral or a valve in mitral annular calcification. So, just to summarize, what are the potential advantages of transcatheter mitral valve replacement? There's the versatility. You can treat all types of mitral regurgitation. None of these procedures are simple, but looking at the complexity of all of these transcatheter procedures, it is relatively simple, and it has predictable results. One has the potential to eliminate mitral regurgitation completely. What are some of the issues with transcatheter mitral valve replacement? Well, one issue is access. Most of the devices right now that are being trialed are transapical, and they're being trialed in patients who are extremely sick, who don't have surgical options. As I think we all know, apical access does increase the morbidity of the procedure. So all of these procedures are also, all of these devices are also have a, there's a plan to deliver them transeptally, which does make the morbidity of the procedure a lot less. And so access is potentially one issue. And remember, transcatheter mitral valve repair devices are all transeptal at this time. There's the issue of the tricuspid valve. When you compare it with surgery, we certainly don't address tricuspid regurgitation at the time we fix the mitral valve. In patients at prohibitive surgical risk, it may not be an issue, but certainly for younger patients, if you don't address the tricuspid valve, it may be an issue, because patients certainly do better when severe tricuspid regurgitation is addressed at the time of mitral surgery. There's potentially the issue of AFib. Frequently, these patients have AFib, and a maze procedure can be done at the time of mitral valve surgery. It's not really done at the time of transcatheter mitral valve replacement. There's the issue of paravalvular leakage. If there is paravalvular leakage around the mitral valve, it's much worse than other types of paravalvular leakage. Certainly after aortic valve, it's tolerated much less than after mitral valve. There's the issue of the surrounding structures around the mitral valve, such as the aortic valve, the LVOT, the circumflex artery, the coronary sinus, the His bundle, the AV groove, myocardium itself. So LVOT obstruction is one of the biggest Achilles heels of this procedure. In surgical mitral valve replacement, typically the anterior leaflet is resected out of the way. In TMVR, it's left in place and displaced in the left ventricular outflow tract. So what you can end up with is left ventricular outflow tract obstruction with a gradient at the LVOT. So there are different methods of assessing this risk, anywhere from low to high risk, not only looking at device protrusion into the LVOT, depending on the device type, the actual angulation between the aortic valve and the mitral device, so aortomitral angulation, the flaring of the device in the ventricle, and the presence or absence of the septal bulge, which are all features defined high or low risk. There are various CT methods of describing this new concept of a neo-LVOT, where you take a virtual valve and you put it across the mitral annulus, and then you measure what the new left ventricular outflow tract will be. This is typically done with CT analysis. There's the option of a bailout alcohol septal ablation. This could be done beforehand in high-risk patients, or it can also be done at the time. Obviously, most people would prefer that it be done before the actual procedures to prevent LVOT obstruction. There is this new concept of something called laceration of the anterior mitral leaflet. So basically, the idea is that one would using transcatheter means recreate the surgical method of resecting the anterior mitral leaflet. So taking two multipurpose catheters, one with a sharp wire through it, one would deliver it retrograde, so from the femoral artery across the aortic valve into the LVOT. One would then puncture the anterior mitral leaflet. Then take another catheter and using the snare, which is basically a loop, one would grab this wire here and pull it up, essentially tearing the anterior mitral leaflet and creating, improving the, opening up the neo-LVOT. So you can see in this cartoon here, here's an intact mitral leaflet after a mitral valve was, a transcatheter valve was put in the mitral annulus. And here is what it looks like after this laceration of the anterior mitral leaflet. Here's what it looks like looking at the LVOT. Here's the mitral leaflet protruding into the LVOT. That's the aortic valve there. And here's with it sort of lacerated out of the way. Here's what it looks like in a path specimen. Basically, they've torn the anterior mitral leaflet. So there are some other challenges with TMVR. Obviously, pre-procedural planning is a big part of it, valve sizing, valve positioning. There's imaging, and there's also the access issue, which we briefly touched on. So obviously, pre-procedural planning is quite involved. There is the involvement of CT and 3D TEE to measure various parts of the mitral apparatus, mostly the annulus. There is the assessment of the landing zone, where will the valve land, and the characteristics of the annulus and the atrium. There is the trajectory of the actual delivery of the valve. And then there is the assessment of the neo-LVOT using a simulated or virtual device to make sure that one does not end up with left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. This is just a representation of what a CT analysis of this would look like. There's also a desire to come to some sort of consensus as to how one would define the risk depending on the type of valve one were to use. These are different types of valves placed in the mitral annulus with different fixation devices where they're fixed. Some are fixed with tabs, some with paddles, some have ventricular barbs. This is the Abbott Tendyne device, which has an apical tether to anchor it in place. Fluoral guidance is somewhat suboptimal. As you can see, if you don't have mitral annular calcification, one may end up without good landmarks, and this is a wire in the coronary sinus to guide placement of the device. TEE guidance turns out to be the go-to imaging guidance for this procedure, and it's virtually all TEE guided. Gosh. So, quick overview of TMVR devices. So these are all the devices that are in some sort of trial. Some have sort of fallen out of favor. A lot of them are in some kind of a trial. This is just a quick timeline of how this whole thing is developed. I think once TAVR took off, there was this great investment in a lot of startups to create a transcatheter mitral device. So all of these all of these devices were sort of designed by small startups and then bought up by big companies. So Edwards bought one device, Medtronic bought the other device, and then they sort of renamed the devices once they bought them. So these are four companies that have active clinical programs, so Abbott, Edwards, Medtronic, and Neovasc. These 5 companies with first-in-human studies, and then 12-plus companies who are looking at valves that are in development. So these are the various devices in clinical trials. I'll sort of briefly talk about the 2 main contenders right now, which is the Abbott Tendyne device and the Medtronic Intrepid device. They can be D-shaped or circular, multiple valve sizes, porcine or bovine. They can have a tethered fixation in the apex of the heart, or they can be anchored by barbs in the atrium. The delivery catheter is huge, so clearly this is delivered transapically, 32 French here. Most of these devices are currently transapical, although transeptal devices are coming. And some are retrievable and some are not recapturable. But both of these, Abbott Tendyne and Medtronic Intrepid, are retrievable, will be retrievable if they're not yet. So I'll just talk about one of the devices, because we could talk about these devices for hours. So this is the Medtronic Intrepid device. It's basically a conformable outer edge that engages the mitral annulus and leaflets and provides fixation and sealing. There's the inner stent, which is isolated. That has the bovine pericardium valve, and then the brims, as you can see, are flexible. It conforms to the anatomy, but maintains its circular shape. You don't need to rotate it for alignment. It accommodates tilt and lateral misalignment, and basically acts like a cork in a bottle by plugging the mitral annulus. This is what it looks like on X-ray analysis, and these are path specimens of what the device may look like. This is the delivery catheter itself. So big delivery catheter. This is just a movie of what a valve deployment would look like. Basically, this is a lady with a severe degenerative MR with P2 flail. As you can see, echo guidance is important. The device is advanced into the left atrium, and then this capsule that encloses the device is gradually pulled back, and then the device is exposed in the left atrium. So this is the apex, and this is the left atrium. The mitral valve is right here. So this device is basically being expanded. And they're being guided mostly by echo, as you can see. When it's partially expanded, they pause. There's alignment. Rapid pacing for final placement. Retract the device into the annulus. Now the device is released. Here's what it looks like fluoroscopically. Although you're looking at both screens at the same time, obviously. So this is just some echo representation of what it looks like deployed. And this is what the deployed valve looks like. Looks nice. I mean, there's no PVL. It's very gratifying, as you can tell. Looks almost like a TAVR valve. Here's what a real-time CT looks 12 months out. So in their pilot study, they had successful deployment in 35 out of 37 patients. Exposing the apex took 30 minutes. Deploying the valve took 15 minutes. The mean gradient was 2. Severe MR in the vast majority of patients pre, and mild, trivial to 0 MR in all the patients afterwards. Dramatic improvement in New York Heart Association class. They have follow-up up to 24 months. 4 patients have died from some sort of procedural issue. The other deaths were related to non-procedural issues. So there is obviously a trial ongoing with these inclusion criteria. Obviously, access has to be transapical. These are some exclusion criteria. Main one being severe pulmonary hypertension or extremely low LVEF. You can see there wasn't a need for any contrast in the procedure. So, in conclusion, surgery remains a gold standard treatment of vast majority of patients who need mitral valve repair or replacement, primarily for mitral regurgitation. We went over the challenges for the transcatheter mitral valve replacement, design, patient selection, imaging, and planning. There are issues, the main one being left ventricular outflow tract obstruction, which are serious, but there are some fixes for those complications. And I think this technology will primarily, at least for the first few years, be only for patients who are prohibitive risk for surgery. It has the potential, and there's talk that the discussion will be whether a patient should get transcatheter mitral valve replacement or MitraClip. Because if you can imagine, once you put a MitraClip in place, it's very difficult to do this procedure. And the MitraClip, at least at this point, is not retrievable. There's talk whether the MitraClip itself should be a retrievable type of device, so you can preserve the patient's mitral valve for this procedure in the future. Whether the discussion should be to put this valve in from the get-go once it's available. That's it. Thank you.
So, a couple of questions. So you said that most devices will be transeptal, but that one is transapical.
Most devices currently are transapical.
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 Okay.
Because it's the easiest and the sheet size is big. But both the front runners, the Abbott device, the Tendyne, and this Medtronic device, they have transeptal delivery systems in the works. So they realize that.
So you think the future is transeptal?
Transeptal.
And any sense as to the need for repair of the atrial septum to close it after, given the size of the delivery system?
Yeah, I mean, we don't do it typically for MitraClip. That sheet size is half the sheet size of this. But yeah, you can put an atrial septal closure device.
And the other one, I couldn't quite understand the significance of mitral ion calcification. In other words, is it good because it provides kind of like when you do a TAVR, more opportunity to anchor the valve, or is it bad to have calcification?
Well, I think it's good and bad. The bad is that it may not seal as much as a non-calcified valve, and you might have paravalvular leak with a replacement valve. And so that is the main issue. And it may be that for a calcified mitral annulus, you need a separate type of device that seals that annulus better than this type of device.
Any questions?
I have a similar vein to that. In terms of MAC, if the MAC is more asymmetric, is there a risk in theory of the balloon, sort of rupturing the annulus in a way where there's more compliance in the non-calcified area? So if there's asymmetric MAC, would that be a risk factor for complications?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's all about device sizing, I guess. That's what we do with TAVR. TAVR frequently has asymmetric calcification in the aortic annulus, and you just have to be careful to size it appropriately. There's always a little bit of give at the end, so you can fine-tune it right at the end to close any gaps that you have. But there's always a risk that you will trade PVL for safety, meaning you're worried about rupture. But asymmetric, not necessarily, as long as you size it properly. If you oversize it, yes, but not just the asymmetric nature of the mitral annular calcification by itself shouldn't be an issue, provided you size it properly.
Great.
Can these patients also get TAVR? Or is there not enough space in the LVOT?
They can get TAVR. They can also get left atrial appendage closure. Any orifice in the heart can be closed.
We should play the AFib before you close the septum.
Yes, and obviously, everyone does need their piece of the pie.
That's the last one.
Did you run across any more recent data for repairs after MitraClip, surgical repair post? They published it for the Everest trial.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen what the more recent data is.
Yeah, I haven't. I think the best data would probably be from the TVT registry. I haven't looked at that recently.
The issue of LVOT obstruction is an interesting one. And remember, one case of, sometimes surgeons will leave the entire mitral valve. Isn't that correct? And that in patients with chronic severe myocardial ventricles, as the ventricle shrinks, so that's the outflow tract in a way. And so I remember seeing one patient, an N of 1, but I can see how if you're doing this that the LVOT obstruction may not develop immediately because the ventricle is more dilated, but as the ventricle shrinks as a consequence of eliminating the mitral regurgitation, then you may see late LVOT obstruction. So I think that, I guess that study was in animals, right, where they lacerated that.
No, they've done human trials.
Yes.
They have. Yeah.
Lacerated the
Lacerating the anterior leaflet. Yeah.
That may be an issue. Any other questions? Thank you.